So this next video is going to talk about the shifters of the supply curve and also the demand curve of the loanable funds market. I want for you to organize your notes accordingly. Basically, I want for you to have where there are two sectors of the economy that affect the supply curve, which are households. This is saving their money, remember we said. And then the rest of the world, this is capital inflow. And we'll talk about the shifters in just a minute. Also, the two sectors of the economy that affect demand and borrowing, which are firms and businesses that they borrow money for capital stock. And number two, governments when they run a budget deficit. Okay, so this might not be, this might not be enough space for you to write absolutely everything. You could probably have an additional like notes page where you're writing down the notes that I'm going to go over in just a minute, and so that way that can help you as well. So I'm going to go over the shifters as well as go over a couple of the scenarios to help you with the assignment and the FRQs that are on Google Classroom. So the shifters of the demand curve, if you want to label this shifters of the demand of loanable funds, that'll be great. The shifters, the first shifter affects basically businesses, and these are changes, they call it changes in perceived business opportunities. So this is basically affects the first sector of the economy, businesses. We're talking about the demand curve again. So again, going back to your notes page, if I may, this is the demand and borrowing section. This right here is businesses. So they are the first ones that demand loanable funds. This is where you could be writing this shift. Okay, so the shifters of the demand of loanable funds, changes in business opportunities affect firms and how they borrow money. So essentially, if they know that we are going to have a good economy, let's say that our economy is going to be good. There are all of these reports, economic reports, the Federal Reserve Bank is saying that our economy is going to be booming for the next few years, then it gives businesses an opportunity, like a sense of security, in the sense that if they borrow money, they know they're going to be able to pay it back. So if they think that businesses are going to be booming, the demand of loanable funds is going to go up and it's going to shift to the right. Okay, if we know that our economy is going to be bad, like when a lot of people started to notice that businesses were going to start closing down with the regulations of social distancing through this pandemic, they knew that it's going to affect our economy tremendously. Businesses are not going to be set up to borrow money quite at this time, because if they can't make profit enough to pay back that loan, they're not going to want to borrow money. Remember the rate of return. So the demand of loanable funds would go down and it would shift to the left. So this basically is common sense. If our economy is booming, businesses are going to want to borrow money. Remember that businesses want to borrow money so that they can invest in capital investment projects. That means that they want to buy more tools, more equipment, more machinery. They want to invest in their company by opening up a new factory so that they can increase production. And so that they can then yield more economic growth. When we're increasing our production, GDP goes up, economic growth goes up, and we're doing great. When we don't essentially invest in our businesses, we don't buy enough or better tools, more machinery, more equipment to replace broken down equipment, then our GDP starts to go down, and then it affects our economic growth. The second shifter of the demand curve, and also the second sector that affects demand, has to do with the government. So these are changes in, when there are changes in the government's borrowing. This also yields to a situation, or a situation called crowding out. So what happens here is that, number one, the government is running a budget deficit. Government runs a budget deficit. Deficit means that we don't have enough, is when you spend more money than you're making. Okay, so when it comes to the government, the money that we bring in revenue, the money that we're making, is our tax revenue. It's the taxes that they collect on incomes of people, citizens of the United States, right? When they spend more money than we're bringing in revenue, this can cause a problem because now then the government has to go to the loanable funds market. It causes for them to demand more loanable funds, and it shifts to the right, and the result of that then can be detrimental to our economy. So let me show you via the graph how this is going to look. So if I draw out our loanable funds graph, here is the quantity of loanable funds. Here is the real interest rate, right? We have the supply of loanable funds and the demand of loanable funds. At its equilibrium, here is where the real interest rate results in our economy, and then also the quantity of loanable funds here. And here's the loanable funds market. Remember, label it loanable funds market. Let's say, for example, like the shifter that the government is running a budget deficit and they come in and they demand more loanable funds, it shifts to the right. So when the government comes in and says, hey, we need to borrow money because we spent too much, surprise, surprise, then they cause for this new equilibrium, right, to shift here, and the real interest rate to increase, right, and the quantity of loanable funds to go up as well. When we have this right here happening, when the real interest rate goes up, this is the third kind of like effect of governments borrowing when they run a budget deficit. This interest rate goes up. What did we talk about? How does this affect businesses and borrowing when the interest rate is too high? What happens then is that businesses won't borrow money. Businesses won't borrow. When they don't borrow money, I just mentioned that when they don't borrow money, they don't buy more capital, they don't replace broken down tools, machinery, equipment. Then what happens? If they don't borrow, production starts going down. Our GDP goes down. And finally, our economic growth starts to decline. All of this trickle-down effect is everything that happens because the big bad government came in and said, hey, we spent too much money. Guess what? We need to borrow some of yours. And as a result of this increase in the real interest rates, this causes for this situation of crowding out to happen. Essentially, they crowd out of the market businesses from borrowing any money. And this is really bad for our economy. Sometimes when the government wants to boost GDP, let's say if we're in a time of a recession, and hopefully we'll get to cover all of that before our AP test, then they'll increase government spending or they'll lower taxes to indirectly affect GDP. And when they do increase government spending so much to help boost our economy, sometimes then they end up having to essentially then decrease our economic growth. They're not going to help our economy. Instead, they're going to hurt our economy. So this is the scenario of crowding out. Okay. Alrighty, let's go back then to the shifters of the supply curve. So shifters of the supply curve, shifters of the supply of loanable funds, I should say, are the very first one, and we said that savers saving their money. So one of the shifters is changes in private savings behavior. Private meaning like individual households and what they do with their savings. Okay, so if people are changing their behavior, their spending behavior, savings, or spending, regardless, because remember there's only two things that you can do with your money, save it or spend it, then it's going to cause a shift of the supply curve to the loanable funds market. So let's say, for example, that the real interest rate is really high. Remember we said you can only save or spend your money. At higher interest rates, we have an incentive to save our money. So we're going to save our money. We're going to save more money, right, if interest rates go up. And we are it's going to cause for the supply of loanable funds to go up and shift to the right. because if more people are saving their money, that's more money in the banks that banks can loan out, and that's where the supply of loanable funds comes from. If, let's say, for example, that our interest rates are really low, then how we're not going to save as much money. There's not an incentive to put our money in the bank if we're not going to be earning as much interest. So we're going to spend it instead. We're going to spend more and save less. And if we are saving less, then the supply of loanable funds is going to go down and shift to the left. And so then it'll affect the real interest rate accordingly. And we'll go over some examples a little bit later. Okay, the second the second shifter of the supply of loanable funds are changes in capital inflow. Remember when we said that the rest of the world, this was household savings, this is the rest of the world. ROW means the rest of the world. Whenever they want to invest in our banks, let's say, for example, that our banks are offering a higher interest rate than their individual banks in their specific countries, then they want to invest in our banks because there's a higher incentive, or they can earn more on their investment. So capital inflow, let's say, for example, that if the rest of the world perceives our government to be, for our economy, that we have a good economy, that we have a stable government, that we have better or higher real interest rates, then they're going to invest in our banks. This is called capital inflow. Right? Remember I said in this case, this is money that's coming into our banks. They're going to invest in our banks, and therefore then the supply of loanable funds is going to go up and shift to the right. Okay? The opposite happens if they know that we have a bad economy, or if our government is unstable and they don't trust that our economy is going to do well under an unstable government, or if all of a sudden our interest rates go down, then this is called capital outflow. This is where they take their money out of our banks. Okay, they take their money and they go and invest it somewhere else. So they take their money out, the supply of loanable funds goes down and shifts to the left, and those are the two shifters of the supply. Okay, so hopefully then you can understand what would affect the supply curve and the demand curve of loanable funds. I want to go over, before I end this video, the 4 examples on here, and hopefully then you can understand it a little bit more with scenarios that you will come across in the FRQs. So for example, you have to label the loanable funds market, the quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis. You need to label the real interest rate on the y, the equilibrium, quantity equilibrium, and here the real interest rates, okay? And then you can label the supply and the demand curve of loanable funds. So this is what's happening. It says show an increase in household savings, how an increase in household savings would affect the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds. Well, if we are increasing our household savings, if we go back to over here, if we are saving more, then the supply of loanable funds will go up and it'll shift to the right. So my supply of loanable funds is going to increase and go right. Here's my new equilibrium, QE1. My quantity of loanable funds has gone up and the real interest rate will have gone down. So all you have to do is showing this and this, your new real interest rate and your new quantity equilibrium is enough to show me what happens to the real interest rate and quantity for the prompt. So you'll probably have to, with the FRQ, either draw out your graphs and changes and then upload them like you have been, okay? All right, this second one says to show how an increase in gross private investment affect the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds. again, this is how you label your loanable funds market. Here's the supply, the demand of, the real interest rate at equilibrium, and the quantity equilibrium here. The real interest rate on the Y, quantity of loanable funds on the X. Don't let gross private investment scare you. What does this mean? Gross means overall, the entire economy. We're talking about macroeconomics now, so we're looking at the entire economy. Gross means overall. Private investment means private businesses. And if they're investing in their economy, that means that they're borrowing money to invest in capital stock. Capital investment, private investment, those are all the same thing. And they basically are businesses borrowing money in order to buy more tools, more machinery, more equipment. So if they're increasing their gross private investment, that means that they are borrowing more money. Remember, borrowers are the demand side of the loanable funds. They're the ones that are borrowing loanable funds. They're the ones who demand loanable funds. So if businesses are borrowing more, the demand is going to go up, shift to the right. Here's our new equilibrium. You're going to have to show that the interest rate has increased and that the quantity of loanable funds has also increased as well. Okay. Fourth scenario says or show an impact of a decision by private, public, and foreign sectors to reduce borrowing. This is pretty straightforward. This is the quantity of loanable funds, again, the real interest rate, supply and demand, the loanable funds market, sorry. I should have pre-labeled all these, but I've already started, so. Okay, if everybody is going to reduce borrowing, borrowing again affects the demand of loanable funds. And if we are borrowing less, then the overall demand of loanable funds is going to shift to the left. Here's our new market equilibrium, meaning that the real interest rate is going to go down overall, and the quantity of loanable funds is also going to go down. And you showing that shift is all that you need to do to show that. Okay. Number 4 says, let's label this first, the real interest rate, the quantity of loanable funds, your equilibrium. So here it says, if a capital outflow were to occur, then how would the market for loanable funds be affected? If people are taking their money out of our economy, that means that they're taking money out of our banks. We don't have as much money then to lend out in the loanable funds market. This affects the supply of loanable funds. And if they're taking their money out of our economy, the supply of loanable funds shifts to the left. This is going to make the real interest rate go up and the quantity of loanable funds to go down. And that's basically it. The one thing that you should remember are the 4 sectors of the economy that affect each of these curves. I want for you to know that, and just to go over the supply, what causes for the supply curve to shift? Well, it's savers saving their money, okay? Savers, savings. If they're saving more, then supply goes up. If they're saving less, supply goes down. The rest of the world, this is capital inflow and capital outflow. So if the rest of the world is investing in our banks, the supply of loanable fund goes up because we have more money in banks that banks can lend out. So the supply goes up. If capital outflow occurs, well then the supply is going to go down and shift to the left. The 2 sectors of the economy that demand and borrow loanable funds right here, if you can't really see that, are firms and businesses. Remember, businesses, this is a capital investment. So if they are going to, if any investment is happening in our economy, demand is going to go up and it's going to shift to the right. If we are in a bad economic situation, then we're not going to demand as much loanable funds because nobody's going to want to borrow money at higher interest rates or during a bad economic time. And so then that's basically it. And then we have the government borrowing when they are running a budget deficit. And remember that this could be bad for our economy. governments that spend money to help boost our economy with every good intention start off by increasing government spending, but if they spend too much, it could actually be bad for our economy. It could end up being bad for our economy because, again, remember that this is called crowding out. This yields to crowding out. If ever you see one of like the loanable funds market come out on the economics, like the AP macro test, they're more than likely going to ask you about crowding out because it's always going to lead to that. More than likely, or a scenario that affects, like, let's say the real interest rate here, they'll ask you, well, how does that affect the money market graph, which we'll cover the money market next week. And then they'll tie in all of these other different graphs based on what's happening per model. So I hope that you have some sort of understanding of the loanable funds market. If you need any help, please stop by my virtual tutoring hours from 2:30 to 3:30. Watch every one of these videos in order because it'll therefore more so help you with going over and just evaluating everything that you need to know about this loanable funds market. I apologize for these videos being a little bit lengthy, but these are the very first models that you will for sure see on the test, and so I want to focus more time on them. So again, if you need any help, please reach out to me via email, Google Hangouts, join my Google meeting from 2:30 to 3:30, and then I'll also we'll also have our normal 3:30 Wednesday meeting on Wednesdays, so that if you need any help with the FRQs as your assignment, then you can do that. So have a great day. I hope that you are doing well and that you enjoy these videos. I hope they're helpful. That's all I ask. And so just let me know if you need anything. Have a good one.